Hi everyone and welcome. What you see here is my VermiBag Mini. The VermiBag Mini was emptied 10 days ago, and that was after the inhabitants of the VermiBag Mini, the European nightcrawlers, that had been in here for quite a while, not quite 700 days. The population that was in this system was, as far as I could tell 10 days ago, 700 days old. But it was after that population had reached a few months old that they had been placed into this system. And in this system they grew and grew, and over quite a long period of time they lived in this system, but 10 days ago they were removed. And as you can see, the system sits here empty, awaiting its next project. But what happened 10 days ago was sort of a to be continued situation, because I took all the material that had been in the system, and I've got a screen, so I screened out all that material, and a lot of the material went through the screen, and what I was left with, all that stuff, came out as a really nice, fine vermicompost, all very small particle size, got a really nice moisture level to it, and I've got a pretty thorough plastic covering trying to keep that moisture level intact so as to not let it dry any further. Besides nice fine castings, it's my assumption that a whole bunch of cocoons probably slid through that screen as well. So I'm treating this as sort of a European nightcrawler nursery. Now on the other hand, what did not go through the screen is what ended up in here. And that was little chunks of material, probably little chunks of pretty much finished castings, which was clumped together, possibly because of excess moisture. And the other thing that got caught in the screen was a whole bunch of worms too. So I left this last time, 10 days ago, as sort of a to be continued situation, because you could see I didn't even sort of commission these as fresh system. There's no label on these. So I'm going to pick up where I left off 10 days ago, and I'll elaborate on what I've got in mind for these as we go. So let's head over to the bench with these, and I'll show you what I'm talking about. So now the way you see things arranged here is pretty much the way we left it last time we were in here. It was the castings, the really nice fine small particle size castings over on this side, and on this side the larger chunk material that did not pass through the screen, as well as all the worms that did get caught in the screen. And what you see here is the stuff that I fished out of the bottom of the VermiBag Mini at the very end. It was stuff that, as far as I could tell, had no worms in it, but nevertheless, I've kept it covered over the past 10 days to make sure that it doesn't dry out excessively. And it's just been sitting here without a real job so far. And there was another thing that came out of the very bottom of the VermiBag Mini, which was down at the hole where you would normally empty material out of the container. And it was a little plug of very hard material that it was kind of a combination of maybe castings and maybe some materials that had not broken down, some bedding type materials, but it was such a hard chunk that I couldn't even break it. So my idea was to submerge it down here within this material, right in the center, so that it might capture some of the moisture of the surrounding material and possibly soften up a little bit. But my idea here was to actually take this plug, or whatever you want to refer to it as, and take it out of here, and you can see it right here. I'm assuming that now, 10 days after it's been sitting in somewhat more damp material, that it might actually allow me to break it apart so we could check out what it looks like. But this is the stuff that was at the very bottom of the VermiBag Mini, at the harvest panel, or I forget what it's called, but I think there's a specific name for that opening at the bottom where you eject the materials out the bottom. Harvest panel, I believe. And I believe that for the most part this stuff probably is castings, but it's still kind of tough. At least I'm able to break it apart a little bit now. But I figured I would keep it separate from the rest of the stuff, since it is a little bit different, and it is kind of in that same category of all that other stuff, quote unquote, was not really what I considered to be the material that the worms were inhabiting, which ended up here. So it's kind of that leftovers, if you will. So I thought it might be a good idea at this point to put some of this stuff to good use. And my idea for that was to sort of set the stage for eventually trying to get both the adult worms out of this material so that this too can be treated as finished castings, and then at some point, once the baby worms start hatching out of this stuff over here, that we would also try to convince the baby worms to exit this stuff as well. So much the same way as I've got in another European nightcrawler system, I'm going to set this up the way I did in there, which was to actually have a future feeding area on the edge of the bin. And I wasn't going to add food. My only idea was to use some cardboard that I had prepared for that, maybe just using a thin piece of newspaper or something to create it as a little bit of a divider so that I can distinguish one side of it from the other. And then at some point in the future, when I think it's time, we'll initiate a migration of the worms out of both of these systems. And then at that point, we might be able to consider, you know, everything that remains as finished castings. And maybe by that time, this stuff will have dried enough that we can kind of crumble it more readily and have stuff that could even potentially run through a screen. And after 10 days of not being covered very thoroughly, my hope is that this stuff here is actually becoming fine enough that we can possibly screen it soon. We're already starting to bump into a couple of the worms that inhabit this. And what's in here is really all the worms that once lived in that VermiBag Mini. And hopefully they're still doing okay. My assumption is that the material that they're in still has, you know, some leftover bits of food and stuff and ample moisture for them to be comfortable in. But I also thought that on a regular basis I'd come in and check on this system and also at the same time try to crumble up some of this stuff into a somewhat finer consistency material. And as you can see, it happens pretty easily. But I also think that it would benefit from taking some of this more dry stuff that's been exposed to the air for over the past 10 days and combining it with the more damp stuff that's down below. So when I'm all said and done here today, I'd like to have, number one, kind of stirred up this material, possibly crumbling some of it along the way, and at the same time we'll be able to check out how the worms in here are coming along. And then at the end, we're going to nudge the material in here as well as in here off to the side and create sort of a future feeding zone using not only the cardboard that I've chopped up for this, but we'll also put this stuff back into service over there as well on the edge. So we've got a pretty good amount of material to do that with. And for the most part, this stuff's got a nice dampness, moisture level to it down low. Now combined with this somewhat drier stuff. But I'm going to go ahead and soak what's in here. So I'm going to add some water to this and start letting it soak in water so that it's pretty much soaked when we put it to use. So I think we'll start over here, since I was already kind of rummaging around. I'm going to try to do this in a way that I don't really disrupt this towel that you can see resting underneath the material. I put this in here mainly because the bin does have perforations and holes on the bottom. And I don't want to have any of this stuff as it starts to become more fine and crumbly. I don't want it passing through those holes and making a mess everywhere. So the towel's job is really to basically prevent the material from passing through the little holes on the bottom. And I guess at the same time, since it went in here dry, it's also helping to absorb a little bit of the moisture of the surrounding material. So I'm kind of winging it. I'm trying to figure out how to categorize what I've done here, because in the past I've always somehow managed to end up with you know, a container of pretty much finished castings and then a container of worms only. And in this case that just didn't pan out quite that way. So I decided in my tracking spreadsheet that I'm really going to sort of treat this all as sort of an ongoing foraging of all the material that was in the VermiBag Mini. Just relocated into a space where I can give it all better exposure to air. In this case, giving it a chance to dry. Over here, not so important, and for that reason I'm keeping it covered because I don't want this to dry much more. And then at some point we'll be able to really, using a horizontal migration method, lure all the worms out of the material, and then finally give them a nice fresh home with fresh food, fresh bedding, and everything else. But in the meantime, these adult worms in this container, as well as the baby worms that are going to start emerging from the cocoons over there, are all still more or less living in the material that they've been in for, at this point, 710 days. So people did ask whether I'm going to continue with the day count of this population and their age. And I doubt it. I don't think I will. But I just figured since it is easy math at this point to maintain a handle on how old the worms here are, or how old the population is, I would make mention of it. But I really don't even know if worms live that long that you could really imagine that any of these were the worms that I launched off as cocoons 710 days ago. These might just be the children or the grandchildren of those initial worms that emerged from those cocoons. But I really don't know. Maybe worms do live years and years, and maybe some of these were actually the original first generation that came out of those cocoons that I received from the crazy worm lady all those days and years ago at this point. I mean, May 26th. We are now in May, so pretty soon it will be 2 years. So whether a European nightcrawler can live 2 years or not, I do not know. But if they do, then some of these could actually be from that initial launch of cocoons. So now I probably should come in here on a somewhat regular basis and try to do what I'm doing here, which is try to find chunks of material that do break up, so that over time this stuff can all become nice and fine and flowing. I can feel almost every handful of this stuff breaking apart pretty easily, so that I don't have big chunks in my hand anymore. I've just got the little tiny particles. But some of the stuff that was out on the surface probably will not do that yet. So that stuff's kind of dry. Once that stuff gets submerged and mixed in, it'll dampen a little bit and possibly become a little bit easier to manipulate and get busted up into smaller chunks. And it'll go through a few iterations of that, I believe. And then eventually the material will be pretty much depleted of any remaining food scraps, I believe. And then someday in the near future, when we do set up a migration zone with some fresh food for these little guys, they'll be pretty motivated to make their move into that fresh feeding area. That was kind of cool. I didn't anticipate being able to do that, but that was kind of cool, just being able to lift up the towel and take a quick peek underneath to see what's going on there. And at the same time, clean off what's right there. So I've got to go put some water on this, so I'm going to go visit the sink. So I'm going to take a short break right now so I can start dampening this stuff. And then maybe we'll go ahead and we'll set up that future feeding zone, kind of just a bedding area at this point. And then we'll backfill it, we'll till up some of the material on this side, and then we'll do the same over there. But the first thing is going to be getting this stuff nice and wet. So let's begin with that. So what we have here is the cardboard that I showed earlier, but it's been thoroughly dampened, so it's all soaking wet. I poured off the standing water, but it sat in water for quite a while. And while I was busy at the sink, I was curious to see what was going on down in here, because I could see little concentrations of dark little spots and things moving. So I positioned my cell phone camera over here just to get a couple clips of what was going on. And as you can see, this bin has a good number of little creepy crawlies hanging out in it. I don't know if they're right on the surface only, or if it's, you know, Is it possible that maybe this stuff is, riddled with mites through and through? I don't know for sure, but I could say for certain that the stuff I'm seeing on the surface is mites. And you got to remember that this was covered with plastic. So the plastic covering was creating a nice damp area here on the surface for them to hang out in. So it is possible that the mites are only on the surface. So I'm not sure if we were to probe down into the material what we would find. It might just be a sort of a surface thing. And that kind of goes back to a little test that I had done recently in the other European nightcrawler system, which was to take some of the castings from that other setup and place them into a little plastic bag to see what surfaces. And I think the theory there was that the mites that might be in the material would be on the surface. They'd come to the surface. And I believe we did actually see some stuff cruising around within that material in that other case. But what we could see here is clearly mite activity. And that might be completely normal. But I've kind of been on a mite killing mission lately, or at least an attempt to try to eliminate mites. So I went ahead and I purchased some neem cake. I had tried using the neem oil spray, but it turned out later that I had purchased the wrong type, so it wasn't really ever going to do anything along the lines of eliminating the mites that I was encountering in my systems. But I'm hoping that the neem cake that I had purchased recently, or it's I guess neem seed powder, I believe the way the packaging is labeled. My hope is that the neem cake is actually going to produce that desired result, which is to knock out the mites. So my idea here was to, even though I'm not really in the mode of feeding here or trying to bait the worms out of material quite yet, I figured I would set up this sort of future feeding area in such a way that since it's nice and damp and that it might actually start attracting some sort of creatures over here, I'm going to assume that some of the creatures that it might attract is mites, or mites. And then what I'm going to do is I'm going to actually place some neem cake in the bedding area. I'm not even sure what to call it, It's like a sort of a future horizontal migration feeding zone, but not quite yet, So I don't feel like I've got a worm population that's ready to be baited out of the material quite yet. So it's really just a collection of cardboard, paper, maybe some of this old stuff sitting in here, sort of awaiting the introduction of some nice fresh food that'll be ultimately meant to lure worms over into it. But I'm going to also include some neem cake in there too, sprinkled in with the cardboard and with this other stuff that's going in there too. So I've also crafted a couple pieces of paper over here. They're just old pieces of newspaper that had been top coverings in some of my systems. And it's not really meant to serve as a barrier, so to speak. It's really more for me to be able to distinguish where the finished castings end and where the future feeding area begins. So once we backfill this will stand up straight, but it kind of gives me a cutoff point. So we'll begin over here. We'll drop in a little bit of cardboard as sort of a foundation. I've also got some other little scraps of paper that we can include too. And the stuff is nice and damp, but it'll be combined with some dry stuff too. This stuff over here. But I'm going to go ahead and use about half of what's in here. So I don't want to be hanging on to this stuff. I want to put it to good use. It seems like using it over here might be a good idea. So I think it does have some chunks of stuff that's not yet broken down, although a lot of it is actually finished compost. I'm pretty sure most of what ended up down at the very bottom of my VermiBag Mini was finished compost. But But it is a mix of stuff that didn't ever get broken down either. Maybe because it was just down low, or maybe because it just got compacted so much that worms couldn't make their way into it. Maybe because it was just too darn dry. It's hard to say why. But before I put that top layer of some more cardboard on there, I'm going to sprinkle in a little bit of that neem cake over here into here, so that if the dampness that's in here, or whatever it is, does end up drawing mites in here, maybe it's going to start helping to knock out the mite population a little bit as well. So that by the time we start trying to lure worms over into there, it might be, you know, a place where the mites just don't go or something. I don't know. I'm still a novice when it comes to using this neem cake, but I'm going to go grab that and we'll sprinkle some of that in here as well. So the stuff that I'm referring to is what you see here. It's packaged as neem seed meal. I'm pretty sure what most people refer to it as is neem cake. And I don't know, some people have been referring to using only a couple spoonfuls. So every time I do that, I feel like I'm applying way more than is necessary. And it might just be because it's kind of an awkward big package. I might want to move some of it into a slightly smaller container to make it easier to handle. But in the beginning, I also feel like it might not be a bad idea to, you know, go pretty generous with this stuff. I think I've also seen or heard or read or whatever it is. I think some people have mentioned how if you dampen this stuff, then the mites are more drawn to it, and then it ends up becoming more effective. So let's cover this up now with some more of this cardboard here. And if you've ever heard people talk about the odor of this stuff, it does kind of have that oniony smell. It almost smells like onions. I couldn't put my finger on what the unusual odor of it was, but now that I've smelt it a couple times, it does seem like it's got kind of an odor that's similar to onion. So kind of weird, kind of a little something I'm gonna have to get used to, I suppose, because I always remember coming down into my wormery and just sensing a nice earthy kind of smell. Now I guess my wormery sort of smells like onions a little bit. So that's just a little word of precaution to anyone who's wanting to give this sort of stuff a try, and then, you know, wouldn't want you to be in for a big surprise at the end once you start using it and realizing that this stuff does have a little bit of a pungent odor to it. I'm even wondering if it might be beneficial to sprinkle this stuff right along the top surface. Maybe the mites, when they come up to the surface to try to, you know, get some of the recirculating moisture that is caused by the plastic coverings, maybe they'll nibble on that stuff. Maybe it'll help reduce their numbers. Here again, like I said, I'm a total beginner when it comes to using this stuff. So let's give that a try. For this though, let's see. I'm going to try to administer it in a way that I'm able to sprinkle it kind of lightly. So I think I'm going to pour some into this little plastic cup over here, if I could do so without making a huge mess. Let's just position it here temporarily. I did a pretty good job with that, didn't I? And then maybe with this we can just put down a very gentle sprinkling of this stuff across the top surface. I guess as baby worms start to emerge, maybe they'll come up and eat the stuff too, because I think people have said that worms do really go nuts for this stuff. They really enjoy the flavor of it. But you know, it's not here as worm food per se. It's really here for trying to deal with the mite situation. So I'll save the remainder of this for treating the other system once we get around to setting it up. But I think here we're more or less finished. So I think I'll go ahead and grab the plastic covering, and we'll return the plastic covering onto here so that we don't lose any moisture. especially over this future feeding area. I'd really like for this stuff to maintain its dampness. But then again, the entire container, you know, is full of castings that do seem to have just about the right moisture level to them. So I wouldn't want to see any excessive drying of this to occur. So I like the texture and the moisture level of it, just the way it is. So here, I guess we're going to be able to do more or less the same thing. Let's grab that other little piece of partition paper that I had created for this. Kind of set it up to have the right width, more or less. And then, similarly, we're going to create a little bit of a foundation to place everything else on top of. Here again, we're going to use what remains of this stuff here. Like so. And let's grab that neem cake. These little containers have holes on the bottom of them. I had used them once upon a time as little planters, little seed starters. So it's actually working pretty good as sort of a duster or a shaker. I actually like that. It's not bad. But you know what? Maybe we'll sprinkle a little bit of that stuff out here on the surface as well. Because I don't think I saw quite as many of these little crippy crawlies hanging out in this stuff. But you have to imagine that they're here too. And that if we do treat the top surface with this stuff, then maybe it'll help reduce the number of mites in here. The way I understand this stuff works is that it's not killing them outright, but it's interfering with their ability to reproduce. So it's really kind of preventing that next generation. So, you know, you got to kind of withstand having the current generation around for a little while longer. And then what you're benefiting from is the absence of the next generation being spawned off. So I'm really hoping that this stuff works. I have no first-hand experience of success or failure in either direction, because I just started trying to use this stuff. So in this case, time will tell. And I've certainly, you know, attempted numerous things which ended in failure when it comes to trying to cope with the mites. So I'm not getting my hopes up too high, but a lot of people have, you know, made reference to having good success with this stuff, and I hope I have the same. So we'll roll all this stuff up over into here now, and we didn't really get a chance to check out this side of the container yet. So we'll just give it a quick check out here too. The whole idea just being to bring up some of the more damp stuff from below and submerge the more dry stuff, maybe at the same time trying to crumble it a little bit, but the stuff is still kind of holding together pretty good. And I really wasn't going to take the time when I was harvesting the VermiBag Mini to try to break all this stuff up and crumble it down. I figured at some point in the future, like now, I'd be able to spend a little time here and there working the stuff down gradually, and hopefully we'll end up with some nice fine vermicompost on this side too. And then pretty soon we'll be able to start luring these worms out of this material by placing some nice delicious food for them over there. And I think they'll be pretty motivated to get over there, because this stuff will continue to dry. It'll continue to get depleted of any sort of food that they might still be able to take advantage of. And then we'll be able to relocate them into nice fresh bedding, fresh food, a whole new fresh environment. So for now, I'm just sort of continuing this as is, as sort of a foraging process, so to speak. I'm almost thinking it's time to get a similar cover to this, because then I could really keep that well covered, and I can sort of tuck it in a little bit to allow this side to continue drying a little bit better. So let me get another plastic like that. I found these plastic bags to be pretty much the perfect size for these bins. They go right from edge to edge, almost perfectly. But over here, over the stuff that the worms are inhabiting, I'd like to see this stuff continue to shed some of its moisture over time, so I'm leaving spaces for the air to flow and for the material to be able to dry. And it's just over on the edge that I'd like for the cardboard to remain nice and damp. Who knows, maybe the moisture will start luring mites over in both cases. And then the neem cake can actually do its job and maybe help reduce our mite numbers. Boy, would I love to see a success story when it comes to the mites finally. I think I deserve it. Alright everyone, that's it for today's video. I'll take care of putting all this stuff away and getting things cleaned up, but I'm not going to waste your time with that because that's boring. Before I go though, really quick, let me just say thank you. Thanks so much for watching. I hope you enjoyed the video. If you did, please remember to leave me a quick thumbs up. That's always really appreciated. And if you haven't done so already, please also consider subscribing to the channel too. That's really appreciated as well. Alright everyone, have a great day. Thanks for watching.